Okay, what about now?
Yes, we're good to go.
So thank you very much, Victor. And I would like to thank everybody for connecting today on this presentation. I know there are people all over the world. And I also would like to thank the committee for the invitation to be part of this conference. This is one of the largest beef cattle reproduction conferences in the world. So it's an honor for me to be here and share some of the research data that we have been conducted over the past few years, and also some of our colleagues have done an outstanding job on that research topic as well. So for my presentation, I'm going to focus on what are some of the current nutritional strategies that we could apply at a very strategic times of a life of this calf to enhance their long-term growth and reproductions, particularly of beef heifers. Okay, so I divided this presentation in two parts. The first part, I'll be talking about the mechanisms that are related to puberty attainment, not a lot, just a brief overview, and also the importance of the timing of attaining puberty. And then for the second half of the presentation, I'm going to focus on what are some of those nutritional strategies that we can do to boost their long-term performance. As you guys are going to realize, okay, all of those strategies that I'm going to talk tonight on this presentation, this series, is mostly during early stages of a calf's life. I'm not going to focus on post-weaning strategy, as several other presentations have covered it. I just wanted to bring it to you some of the new strategies, and I want to explain why I believe that these strategies, when applied in early stages of that calf life, can have a tremendous impact on their overall reproductive performance. Okay, so you guys will see that the whole presentation, I'm talking about breeding heifers as yearlings, right? Because we want to maximize their lifetime productivity. So for that to happen, we need to make them become pregnant by 15 months of age, which means that they need to reach puberty by 12 to 13 months of age, right? So we know for years now, since 1987, that heifers that are bred on the third estrus cycle, they have greater pregnancy rates than those that are bred in the first estrus cycle. So this is a clear example why those heifers in each puberty sooner, right? And before the start of breeding season to optimize their reproductive performance. So to give you an example, I'm going to show you two studies. The first one was done in 2 years, okay? And then the one in the bottom was done for 3 years with developing Brandus heifers here in Florida. And then this study was just looking at post-weaning strategies, okay? But at the end of the study, what we wanted to look at is what's the difference in reproductive performance between heifers that achieve puberty before the start of the breeding season, so you call them pubertal at the start of the breeding season, and those that reach puberty only after the breeding season had started. Okay, so 100% of those heifers had a chance to conceive. They reached puberty before the end of the study. The only difference is if they achieve puberty before or during the breeding season. Okay, so what we've seen is that it's very consistent response among years, and then between those two studies is that heifers that achieve puberty sooner, right, before the start of breeding season, they had much greater reproductive performance than those that are achieving puberty during the breeding season, right? So timing of puberty attainment is quite important. It's necessary to optimize the reproductive performance of those cows, not only in terms of number of heifers getting pregnant, but also when affecting the calving distribution. We also seen that heifers that achieve puberty before the start of the breeding season, obviously they calve earlier. So within the first 21 days of the calving season, of their first calving season, you have about 70% of those heifers that had already calved if they reach puberty before the start of breeding season, compared to only 40%. Okay, so it's not only the number of heifers, but also when the pregnancy occurs. And Dr. Cushman showed a few years ago the importance of calving distribution over the lifetime productivity of the heifer. He showed that heifers that calve during the first 21 days of their first calving season, they had greater pregnancy rates for the next 6 generations compared to those that calve during the second or third period of 21 days of this calving window, right? And this is simply because those heifers, by calving earlier, they have more time to recover before the next breeding season, more chances of getting pregnant during the defined breeding season, right? They also saw that those heifers that calve earlier, obviously, they wean older calves, and they were heavier at the time of weaning in the next 6 generations compared to those that were calving later in the calving season. And probably most importantly, they remain longer in the herd. So the longevity of those heifers is increased. So the reason that's so important is that you have more years to dilute the cost of developing those heifers. Okay, so these data should be enough reason to show you that it's important to make sure that those heifers reach puberty, not during the breeding season, but way before, to optimize their reproductive performance. So for the rest of the presentations, I'm going to show very applied studies, and I'm going to show you what can we do in order for that to happen. And as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, I'm not going to talk about post-weaning strategies. I'm going to talk mostly about pre-weaning or strategies early in life, because we believe they have more potential for affecting puberty age compared to post-weaning strategies, right? And the reason for that is very simple, right? So first of all, at early stages in their life, their feed efficiency is quite high. So you're never going to have an animal as efficient in terms of converting feed into gain as they are in early stages ever in their life. So the most efficient time for them is as early as possible. So that offers us an opportunity to minimize feed costs and harvest that better feed efficiency. And also, these animals that are in a relatively young age, okay, they are still susceptible to a lot of their environment effects. So that's when we talk about the metabolic imprinting concept. This is a concept that the nutrition during early stages in their life, for example, the first few months after birth, can modulate how those animals continue to develop and affect their metabolism permanently, and therefore affect their long-term performance. It's a quite similar concept to fetal programming. The difference is that fetal programming is the nutrition during gestation, whereas metabolic imprinting is the nutrition during the first few months after birth, okay, leading to changes in their metabolism and therefore affecting their long-term performance. It seems that those calves that are really young, they still provide that window where we can explore this concept of metabolic imprinting, which doesn't happen later in their lives. So for example, puberty attainment is something that is susceptible to metabolic imprinting, as I'm going to show you. So puberty achievement is a very complex process, right? It involves a very complex network of biochemical, biological, physiological reactions, okay, leading to a gradual, that this animal gradually achieves puberty. So for example, this is a figure that was created by Dr. Day in 2009 in one of his presentations that exemplifies that. So for example, here you have several stages of development for this puberty attainment in those heifers, right? So from 2 to 6 months, we call it developmental phase. From 6 to 10 as a static phase. But what you guys can see here is there's a gradual decline in the negative feedback of estradiol, all right? And at the same time that this happens, there's an increase in the LH secretion frequency, and that ultimately leads to ovulation. So what I'm going to show you is that recent data, right, shows that when you enhance their nutrition during this particular stage here, from 2 to 6 months of age, you can actually eliminate the subsequent period or shorten this static phase, and therefore the decline in this negative feedback of estradiol happens sooner. Therefore, those heifers are able to achieve puberty sooner. And I'm also going to show you that, in fact, even more recent data suggests that we cannot achieve the same end results by enhancing their nutrition even earlier than that. Okay, from birth to 2 months of age, or even during gestation, we should be able to also have some enhancement on how their puberty reproductive axis is developing, and therefore enhancing their long-term reproductive performance. The mechanisms are several. I'm not going to be specific and spend too much time on it because I want to focus on the applied studies. But our colleagues at Texas A&M, they have done an outstanding job generating the basic data, right? What happens at the brain level, the cellular level, or the molecular level that explains why those heifers that are on an enhanced nutritional status, why do they achieve puberty sooner? But so overall, just to give you an idea, when you enhance the nutrition at those critical moments of development, when they're really young, you cause morphological changes in their brain. You enhance the expression of genes that are controlling puberty attainment. There's also some physiological changes where you enhance the secretion of GnRH and LH, all right? And also there's a decline in the sensitivity of estradiol, the negative feedback of estradiol. And recently, even more recently, I think this paper was published not even a month ago, and they show that those heifers that are assigned to a high gain during early stages of their life, they have greater reproductive tract development. So what they did, for example, they had heifers that were assigned to a high average daily gain from 3 to 21 weeks of age, or moderate, right, about half of a kilo of average daily gain per day from 3 to 21 weeks of age. And what they saw is that those heifers on a high average daily gain, they have greater reproductive tract as a percentage of body weight. So even if you account for differences in body weight, they still have greater reproductive tract. So that shows you that by speeding up, right, by boosting their nutritional early stages of their life, we're able to accelerate how their reproductive axis mature, and therefore those heifers achieve puberty sooner. All right, there's several other data that could explain. There's some data suggesting there are methylation, epigenetics effects as well, but I'm not going to show you on this presentation. I'm going to focus mostly on the applied study. So one thing that I forgot to mention here is that when we're running studies regarding nutritional development of females, okay, not always we're able to measure all of these consequences to their body and how that affects their age of puberty. So one way that we usually apply for most of these studies looking at nutrition of beef heifers is to look at some metabolic signals, for example, leptin, insulin, and IGF-1. Those are metabolic messengers, okay? They're the link between reproduction and nutrition. Right? Some of these hormones and metabolites, they have direct and indirect effects on reproduction. So for example, IGF-1 is correlated with follicular development and also maintenance of pregnancy right after conception. So all of these hormones and metabolites, they interact among each other and they lead to a cascade of events that promotes reproductive performance of those heifers. So for example, one of the studies that we ran, and I'm going to mention a little more details about that study in a minute, we look at different nutritional strategies during early their life and how that affects their puberty attainment. Okay, and at the end of the study, we try to evaluate what are the factors that are correlated with age of puberty of all the data that we collected. And the only ones that we found that was significantly correlated with age of puberty was the average daily gain during that critical window of development that I showed you at the beginning, from 2 to 6 months of age, and also plasma concentrations of IGF-1. Okay, so for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to show you some of the nutritional strategies that are capable of enhancing growth and circulating concentrations of IGF-1, for example, during this critical window of development, and how does that affect their future reproductive performance. So the first strategy that I'll talk about is early weaning. Early weaning technically is weaning a calf earlier than the conventional age. So people do 5, 6 months of age and call it early weaning. But for the presentation, when I refer to early weaning, I'm talking about calves that are weaned at 2 to 6 months, 2 to 3 months of age, on the first day of the breeding season of their mothers. This is a great strategy to increase reproductive performance of the cows, okay? Particularly first calf cows. You can substantially increase their pregnancy rates when you early wean their calves on the first day of the breeding season. But that strategy also allows you to modulate 100% of the diet of that calf at a really strategic age. So those calves are really young, highly efficient in converting nutrients into gain. And also they are right at the beginning of this critical window of development for puberty attainment. So you have an opportunity to boost their growth right after early weaning and then modulate how they're going to perform in the future. So for example, in 2006, Dr. Mike Day, when he was at the Ohio State University, him and along other colleagues at Texas A&M, they start generating a lot of data with early weaning. Okay, so in their study, what they had was Bos-Taurus heifers that were either early weaned at 100 days of age or normally weaned at 200 days of age. And they saw that when you early wean them at 100 days of age and you put them on a high concentrate diet, this is the orange line here, their puberty attainment is significantly increased, and you had about 100% of those animals reaching puberty before the end of the study, compared to animals that are normally weaned at 200 days of age, which is this black line here. Now, the green line is calves that were early weaned, also at 100 days of age, but they were fed to achieve the same average daily gain as normally weaned heifers. And you guys can see that there's no differences in their puberty attainment throughout the study. So what that means is that it's not the actual early weaning strategy causing them to reach puberty sooner, but rather the fact that you are immediately applying a high concentrate diet right after the early weaning age, okay? Boosting their intake of energy and protein at a very young age. That's what is leading them to achieve earlier puberty attainment, not necessarily the early weaning management. All right. But like I said, this data was generated in 100% Ball-Staudus animals. And around 2014, we decided to run this study looking at does that strategy also works with Boscinicus influenced animals? We know that when we incorporate some Boscinicus genetics into the herd, we make the challenge of attaining puberty early even harder, right? So we know that those heifers that have some Boscinicus influence, they tend to achieve puberty much later. So we wanted to see if early weaning a high concentrate diet, really young stages of their life, if it would also work with those animals that have some Boscinicus genetics. Okay, so the experimental design was quite simple. We ran that study for about 2 years. We had the control group, which is heifers that remain with the cows on pasture, right? No concentrate supplementation. And they were normally weaned here in July when they were around 9 months of age. And then we had 3 early weaning groups, right? Heifers that were early weaned in January at 2 to 3 months of age. And then we put them in a feedlot at a high concentrate diet, 3.5% of their body weight, for 180 days, right? Until they reached 9 months of age. Then a second early weaning group where we early weaned them in 2 to 3 months of age, we also put them in a feedlot, but for just 90 days. And then after that, we put them back on pasture with concentrate supplementation just to decrease feed costs. The idea of this second early weaning treatment was just to enhance their nutrition during this critical window of development from 2 to 6 months of age. And then once that window closes, right, we would transfer them to pasture and then just decrease their feed costs. And then the final treatment is heifers that are early weaned that kept on pasture with supplementation the whole time, right? So you had all 4 possible combinations of normally weaned and early weaning strategies from 2 to 9 months of age. After that, okay, from 9 months until the end of the study, every heifer was managed exactly the same. Everybody was on pasture, the same type of pasture, and receiving the same amount of concentrate supplementation from 9 months of age until the end of the study. So the only difference is how we fed them from 2 to 9 months of age, okay? So what we saw is that the first 90 days of the study, obviously, those that are early weaned and put on a high concentrate diet, they gain more, right? They gain faster. So by April, they were the heaviest group. Those that were early weaning kept on pasture, they were the lightest. And those heifers that were kept with the cows, they were intermediate here and compared to the other treatments. Now, the second 90-day period from April to July, obviously the ones that stayed in the feedlot after early weaning, they are the heaviest by July. Heifers that were early weaned and kept on pasture, they're the lightest. But we didn't see any differences between those that were kept with the cows and normally weaned here in July, and those that were early weaned and kept on a high concentrate diet for just 90 days. And also their average daily gain from July all the way to the end of the breeding season did not differ between those 2 treatments. So remember that for the next few slides. So the only difference between those 2 treatments is when the majority of their body weight gain happened. So heifers that were with the cows, the majority of their body weight gain happened from April to July, whereas those that were early weaned and put on a high concentrate diet, the majority of their body weight gain happened from January to April, okay, during that critical window of development. So when we look at their puberty attainment, okay, those heifers that were early weaned, kept on a high concentrate diet for 6 months, obviously they're the heaviest, okay, so 100% of those heifers were cycling at the beginning of the breeding season. Now, heifers that were kept with the cows and normally weaned in July, 9 months of age, right? Even though we supplemented them with a relatively high amount of supplement, only 40% of those heifers were cycling at the beginning of the breeding season, only 80% by the end of the breeding season. And this is quite common percentage of puberty attainment that we see in Florida with those heifers that have some Boscinicus influence. You're going to have 40, 50% cycling at the beginning, and sometimes not all of them reach puberty, even though they are supplementing with a relatively high amount of concentrate. Now, those that were early weaned and put on pasture the whole time, no differences in puberty attainment compared to the control group that was with the cows until 9 months of age. Now, look at the ones that were kept on a high concentrate diet for just 90 days, right? 80% of them cycling by the start of the breeding season, 100% before the end of the breeding season. Even though they had exactly the same body weight and age, and average daily gain for most of the study compared to those that remained with the counts. So that's a clear evidence of metabolic imprinting, right? By boosting their growth performance on early stages of their life from 2 to 6 months of age, we were able to almost double the amount of heifers pubertal at the start of the breeding season, even though they had the same body weight and age compared to the control group. So it works, right? With Boston influence cattle, it worked. But at the same time, we published our data from Florida. Dr. Cardozo, Texas A&M, he also published his. We're looking at also early weaning strategies for heifers that have some Boston genetic influence, okay? But in their study, they early weaned all calves at 3.5 months of age. And then they assigned them to several combinations of diets, okay? So a low control diet where the heifers gain a small amount of average daily gain for the entire study. A high control where they were assigned for a high body weight gain for the entire study, okay? All the way to 14 months of age. And then 2 stair-step strategies. These stair-step strategies, it's a great opportunity to boost the growth of animals, okay? And what it does is you pretty much alternate periods of high and low body weight gain. And when you do that, you are able to decrease their nutrient requirements and you induce some compensatory gain. So heifers, they will either gain more with the same amount of feed that would be provided to those that would be on a constant nutritional status, or they will gain the same but consume less feed, okay? You can have either one of these 2 scenarios. But so what they did here is the stair-step strategy 1, right after early weaning, they began with a high body weight gain period from 3.5 to 6.5 months. Then after that, they slowed down, alternated low, high, and low. And then stair-step strategy 2 is the same concept, but it was the opposite in terms of the amount of diet, the type of diet that was offered. So they started with a low gain and then followed by high, low, and high. Okay. And the hypothesis here would be that this stair-step strategy would work better than the control group, the low control, but you would have the best results if you start feeding those heifers on a high nutritional status right after early weaning. Right, so what they saw in terms of puberty attainment was exactly that. Those heifers that were offered the low control diet, they achieved less average daily gain for the entire study. So less heifers achieving puberty until 14 months of age. Those that are on a high control diet for an entire study, they had the greatest performance in terms of puberty attainment. Now, those on a stair-step strategy, they both performed better than the low control. But like I said, the best results were for those that were early weaned and started the stair-step strategy with a high consumption of a high concentrate diet right after early weaning. All right, so what I want to show you is that there's several data showing that early weaning is a great strategy to boost reproductive performance of those heifers. It works not only in Bossalos, but also Boston influence cattle. But the key for the success of this strategy is to associate early weaning with a consumption of high concentrate diets right after early weaning, right between that critical window of development from 2 to 6 months of age. Once that window closes, those heifers would still perform better than the control group, right, or a conventional weaned heifers, but they will not have the best performance as if you have done it a higher consumption of concentrate early in their life. All right. We are running 2 studies in Brazil right now with 100% Nelore heifers to see if in 100% Boston animals, if that strategy also works at the same magnitude. Okay, but according to the data that we have so far, we have no reason to believe it wouldn't work. Now, the next strategy that I want to show you is, unfortunately, not a lot of producers are able to do the early weaning, or they are willing to do the early weaning. Okay, so we have to do some different strategy for those animals. So for the next studies that I'm going to show you is looking at different nutritional strategies that could be applied in a scenario on a beef cattle operation without the need to early wean those heifers. So the first one I want to mention is the use of BST. Okay, this strategy currently is not allowed to be on a commercial side. Okay, you cannot inject calves with the BST, beef calves with the BST at this moment, but hopefully that will change. But this study here is more of a proof of concept to see if can we modulate their growth and IGF-1 concentrations during life, and would that result in differences in puberty attainment that similar to those heifers that are early weaned and put on a high concentrate diet. All right. So BST is an exogenous growth hormone. So when you inject to lactating cows, what it does, it increases milk production. But when you inject to growing animals, it actually promotes their average daily gain and IGF-1 concentration. So this could be a very convenient strategy for in a beef system, right? So for example, here, this first study, we had a group of Brangus heifers, right? Half of them were injected with BST, half of them were injected with saline solution. 3 injections, 14 days apart, starting at 132 days of age. All right, that's the only difference between those 2 treatments. After that, everybody's managed exactly the same. Okay, so very convenient strategy. You're applying to individual animals, and let's see what happened to their performance. So in terms of growth performance, when we injected with the BST, we indeed increased their average daily gain during the first 42 days of the study when we were injecting with the BST. After that, when the injections stopped, the control group started gaining slightly more, but the overall pre-weaning average daily gain didn't differ between those 2 treatments. Okay, and the post-weaning average daily gain also did not differ between those 2 heifers. But we successfully increased their average daily gain during that critical window of development that I mentioned to you before, and we also increased IGF-1. Right, so the treatments worked in terms of growth, achieving a higher growth and a higher concentrations of IGF-1. And then when we look at their puberty attainment, we saw that heifers that were injected with BST during the pre-weaning phase, more heifers attained puberty during the study and at the start of the breeding season, and also they had greater pregnancy rates. Right, and this study was done for 3 years, and it worked perfectly. It's unfortunately that we cannot use that strategy in the commercial side right now, but at least the whole message here shows that it proves the concept. We are able to modulate their reproductive performance by changing their growth and IGF-1 concentrations early in their life without having to early wean and put them on a high concentrate diet. So we decided to run the similar study in Brazil with Nelore calves, all right, 100% Balsinicus. The same idea would be, but we thought that the benefit of this strategy would be even greater in those heifers because the challenge of attaining puberty early in Nelore heifers are much harder than in other breeds of cattle. So what we did is a very similar design with just the minor changes. We started the study a little bit earlier at 80 days of age, and they were assigned to saline or BST injections 10 days apart, okay? But besides that, everything else is the same pastures, same nutritional strategies, everything the same until the end of the study. So what we saw in terms of growth was exactly what I reported to you before. When we are injecting with the BST, we increased their grain. So we successfully increased their growth during the critical stage of their development window. We also increased their IGF-1 concentrations. But something that we did not expect was that the average daily gain of those heifers during the post-weaning phase was slightly decreased when they were injected with the BST during the pre-weaning phase. We really don't know why that happened, and this was completely unexpected. But that partially explains why last heifers that were injected with the BST attained puberty during the study compared to those that were injected with same. So at the end of the day, it worked completely different when I applied the same strategy with the Brangus animal and with 100% Balsinicus. It was not what we expected, but it's very interesting, and it leads to more questions of why that potentially happened and what do we need to do to revert that response? What do we have to do to make sure that they actually boost their reproductive performance and not decrease? But one of the things that we believe was the reason for it, and it's we should always be aware of those differences between breeds, is the concentrations of IGF-1, for example. Balsinicus animals, they naturally have higher concentrations of IGF-1. And then when we injected them with the BST, the increment on plasma concentrations of IGF-1 was much greater compared to the Brangus heifers. So we believe that in this case, it was probably just too much, right? But the message here is that we are able to modulate the reproductive performance of those heifers by changing their nutrition or their management early in their life. Not necessarily we are only stuck with early weaning and high concentrate diet consumption. Okay. Now, the third strategy that I would like to mention to you, and probably a lot of you already thought about that, is the use of crib feeding. This is a way that we could provide supplementation to the calves, and the cows don't have access to that. But most of the studies looking at crib feeding, they apply this strategy closer to weaning, right? So for example, 100 days, 90 days, or 60 days before weaning. So the next study that I'm going to show you, these researchers, they try a different approach. So they tried much sooner than that. And this is a data from Dr. Cook that when he was at Oregon State University, and now he's a professor at Texas A&M University, where they provided, they had a group of Bos Taurus heifers that were offered no crib feed supplementation or access to a crib feed supplement starting at 68 days of age, so really young. When they're really small, they don't eat much and they're very efficient. And they provided supplementation for a relatively short amount of time, just 50 days. So the investment in supplementation here is very low, okay? And then but you're providing a strategic time that they are susceptible to these metabolic imprinting effects. Maybe this will boost their long-term performance, okay? So what they saw is that during the imprinting phase, so the first 50 days when the crib feed is offered, those heifers that were offered the crib feed supplementation, they gain more, okay? And the average consumption of the crib feed supplement was around 0.8% of their body weight. At the time of weaning, those heifers that were offered the crib feeding, they were slightly heavier, about 30 pounds heavier, okay, at the time of weaning. But that difference gradually disappeared before the start of the breeding season. All right. So, however, this strategy really worked. They were able to increase their gain during the first 50 days of the studies when they were really young. They also collected several samples of liver, adipose tissue, and blood samples throughout the study to look at what happens to their physiology, okay, what happens to their metabolism over the entire study. And they saw that genes, for example, that are highly correlated with puberty, like I said, the IGF-1, they were permanently affected by those heifers that were offered crib feed supplementation. So they always had greater expression of IGF-1 in their liver if they were offered crib feed supplementation for just 50 days, starting at 68 days of age, right? So this is another indication of metabolic imprinting. So this strategy is doing something to their physiology, is modulating part of their physiology, okay? Now, even though they didn't see any differences in long-term concentrations of IGF-1, they also successfully increased the IGF-1 concentrations at day 51 of the study, right at the end of the crib feed supplementation. So the treatments worked. They increased their gain and IGF-1 during this critical window that we talked about, right, from 2 to 6 months of age. So, but when we look at their puberty attainment, we didn't see any difference between those two treatments, which was quite surprising because those heifers, they behaved exactly what we wanted in terms of growth and their concentrations of IGF-1. Does that mean that the crib feeding supplementation doesn't work to induce metabolic imprinting effects? Absolutely not. I just think that in this case, perhaps the heifers didn't eat enough, right? So if you remember, their crib feed supplement intake was around 0.8% of their body weight. And if you remember also the studies that I showed you about early weaning and different strategies right after early weaning, there was a treatment that we early weaned those heifers and we put them on pasture with concentrate supplementation at 1%, and their reproductive performance did not differ compared to those control heifers, right? So what I believe here is just that these heifers were so young that they were not able to eat enough of that crib feed supplement to cause any metabolic imprinting effect that would affect their reproductive performance. And it's also possible that if we feed just a little longer, we would have seen differences in their reproductive performance. This is the type of study that needs to be replicated. We need to evaluate in different conditions, right? Greater consumption, different length, different types of animals, different locations, and different breeds as well to see what are the responses. But the fact that we had some evidence suggesting that a short supplementation and a relatively small intake of crib feed was able to modulate cause some metabolic imprinting effects, it gives us a lot of hope that this strategy could still become a great opportunity for beef cattle producers to boost reproductive performance of beef heifers. Okay, we just need to do more studies on that. Now, the final studies that I want to show you is regarding maternal diets. The fetal programming concept, which is by changing the nutrition during gestation, we can actually modulate how the calf develops, affect, for example, the size of ovaries and the follicle count, for example, and also change their reproductive performance. All right, so very similar concept to metabolic imprinting, but now we're talking about even earlier, right? Changing the nutrition during this gestational stage. So what we've seen is, this is the first study I want to show you. It's a very simple design. So what they did, they assigned cows to energy restricted diet, 70% of their requirements, or 100% of their requirements from day 45 to 185 of gestation. And then after that, those cows that were managed exactly the same, those calves that were born, and then they followed those heifers for a long period, okay? And what they saw was that those heifers born from cows that received, that were offered the energy, born from cows that were offered the energy restricted diet, they had smaller ovaries and a smaller CL. Unfortunately, they harvest all the heifers in that study to collect their organs and tissues, so they didn't evaluate their reproductive performance. But this shows you that by changing the nutrition during gestation, you could affect significantly some of their reproductive tract development, right? Now, other studies evaluated their reproductive performance, say they have seen some drastic results. So for example, in this study, the two studies had similar design where they had beef cows that were offered 0 or 1 pound of a protein supplement during late gestation, right? During the last trimester of gestation. And then after that, they were managed exactly the same, and they look at the differences in performance of those heifers born from those cows. So what they saw was the heifers that were born from cows that received supplementation, they were heavier at weaning, they achieved puberty sooner, they had greater pregnancy rates, right? And they also had greater percentage of heifers calving during the first 21 days of their calving season. So quite dramatic results that they observed here. Now, we don't know at this point if this is just because they were heavier at weaning, so they had better reproductive performance, or if this is also due to fetal programming effects. But this data shows you that there's a great potential for this type of research, that with a relatively small investment in supplementation, we can have drastic results in their reproductive performance. So in here, we're talking about 90 pounds of a supplement per cow investment, okay? And we increase pregnancy rates by almost 13 percentage units. If you offer an extra amount of 90 pounds for heifers during a post-weaning phase, we would never have these differences in their reproductive performance. So this shows you here the opportunity for boosting their growth, right? With a relatively small investment in feed supplements. The last study that I want to show is a little bit more recent, just also from Dr. Cushman, and that they look at different combinations of diets during the second and third trimester of gestation. And what does that do to the performance of heifers during the pre-weaning phase and post-weaning phase? So they had 3 diets, okay, diets that were offered to provide 100% of their maintenance nutrient requirements for maintenance, or a low diet that offered only 75 of their maintenance requirements, or 125% of their maintenance requirements. Okay, so they had 4 treatments. The first letter represents the diet that was offered during the second trimester of gestation, and the second letter is the diet that was offered during the third trimester of gestation. All right, so for example, in this treatment here, you have the low diet, 75% of their requirements during the second trimester, and a high diet, 125% of their requirements in the third trimester, okay? And so on. You guys can see here the combinations that they had. So what they see, they applied those treatments to the cows. Once the heifers that were born, they didn't see any differences in birth weights, pre-weaning average daily gain, no differences in weaning body weight, post-weaning average daily gain, and also body weight at the start of the breeding season. Right, so in terms of overall growth performance of those heifers, we didn't see any effect. When they look at their reproductive performance, we didn't see any differences in pubertal heifers. Also, no differences in percentage pregnancy rates, no statistical differences on pregnancy rate. And what we believe that happened in this study here is that we didn't have such a dramatic responses as I reported to you in the previous study, just because of probably the body conditions score of these cows, right? Their mothers, they were in excellent body condition score at the start of the study, around 6. And even in the treatment that was assigned to receive only 75% of their nutrient requirements, where they lost some condition, they lost a very small amount of body condition score, and they were able to calve in an excellent body condition. So in this study here, the cows were really in outstanding nutritional status, and the changes in their nutrition during gestation was very subtle. So that's why we don't have such dramatic response. But they did see right, that heifers born from cows that were offered 100% of their requirements during mid-gestation and 125% of their requirements during late gestation, they had greater calving percentages, and they also had a greater percentage of heifers calving earlier. So even what I wanted to point out in this study is that even in scenarios where cows are in excellent condition, and it seems that they don't need any supplementation, altering their nutritional status or altering their diet during gestation offer us an opportunity to change some of their reproductive parameters. Maybe if the magnitude of changes were greater than what I just showed you, we will have more dramatic differences among those treatments. But again, this is just to show it to you that the opportunity that we have, right? We need to do more data to try to explore this. So as a final message, I hope that I was clear, and I was able to show you that nutritional strategies during early life offer a great opportunity to boost the reproductive performance of heifers. And it's probably a much better time to invest than in post-weaning strategies because the animals are efficient and they're still highly susceptible to these metabolic imprinting effects. In terms of early weaning, we have quite consistent response and boost in puberty attainment in both status and Bolsinicus influence. I'm not sure yet about 100 heifers that are 100% Bolsinicus. The pre-weaning BSC injections is something that we use only to prove the concept, but it did offer a great impact on their reproductive performance. It does prove that we are able to modulate their growth and reproductive performance without having to early wean. In terms of crib feeding, we probably just need to feed a little longer and a greater consumption to achieve better results, but this is something that definitely needs to be replicated. And the maternal nutrition, again, we also need further investigation, but we have some promising results. It just offers more opportunity for the beef cattle producer to boost the overall efficiency of their cow-calf systems and increase the profitability of their system. Okay, so with that, I would like to thank the organizing committee again for allowing me to show this presentation, and I would like to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Moriel. We have questions coming in the Q&A, but the first one, Philippe, maybe if you can comment on any economic analysis that had been performed before looking at early weaning.
Yeah, so I didn't show any of that because, of course, this economic analysis varies the location and what exactly you're doing and year, of course, the price of cattle. But the years that we're only able to make this strategy economically feasible when we have an increase in reproductive performance of the heifers and their mothers too. Okay, so when we remove their calves from the mothers and we increase their pregnancy rates, when you look at the whole system, the benefits of the reproductive performance of the mothers and the heifers, in that scenario, they do pay off. But you're not going to do early weaning just to boost the performance of those heifers, because if you don't have benefit to their mothers in terms of reproductive performance, obviously the early weaning on a high concentrate diet will be a little more expensive. You have to look at the whole scenario, the whole system. And the early weaning is a good strategy. We're just talking about heifers, but if you do with also calves, you're able to increase their carcass quality. So some producers, they might be able to look at that whole scenario and determine if it's going to be feasible for them or not. And like I said, it really depends on the price of feed and the price of cattle, and that varies a lot.
Another question, if you can comment, if you guys ever looked at the effect of feeding that high concentrate diet early on for the heifers on their other development and therefore milking ability?
Yeah, no, we never really looked into that. But I can tell you that we didn't see any differences on weaning weights of their calves as first calf counts. So which would suggest to you that even if you had differences in their milk production, their calves are able to compensate for that. So we haven't seen any differences on their weaning weights, which would be the most important one.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Moriel. There are a number of other questions here on the Q&A tab, and I'm going to ask one last question, then you're going to take a short break. there was a question about if you could comment on what's the difference between doing those nutritional strategies to create heifers that have high fertility versus just selecting for heifers that have the heifer pregnancy EPD, an increased heifer pregnancy EPD?
Well, in my opinion, Victor, they don't exclude each other, right? So you could still do both of them and have a much better response. I don't see why somebody would have to do either one of them. And what our goal is to find multiple strategies, nutritional strategies, to give them wider variety, so that you would, doesn't matter what scenario you are, you would always have an option to use that. Selecting for more fertile heifers is something that we should always do. This is just an extra tool that we might have to boost their reproductive performance. So I hope with time, and as you guys could probably realize, these studies take a long time. So it takes a long time to generate data. And there's a lot of variation, but the potential is there. We hopefully with time, with the work that we're doing, Reynaldo is doing, and other folks in Texas and him, we're going to be able to generate a wide variety of strategies that could be used at the same time. But I wouldn't focus on doing either